So we're going to get started. Good afternoon. Glad we're doing it after lunch, so I'm not in between you and food. My name is Glenn Martin. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for all the work that went into this. I'm the founder and president of an organization called JustLeadershipUSA, and we're a national membership organization with the goal of cutting the number of people under correctional supervision in the United States in half by 2030. So we approach our decarceration work by making a significant investment in the leadership of people and communities most impacted by crime, mass incarceration, and over-policing. So the title of today's panel, Criminal Justice and Community Harm, an Emerging Consensus. This panel will explore the ways in which the traditional criminal justice system has affected high crime communities, the people who live in them, and the broader social fabric. So I'll spend a minute or two just sort of framing the discussion from my perspective, and then I'll introduce you to our speakers, giving titles and their organizational affiliations only. I believe you have their bios. Each speaker will begin by telling the audience a bit about their respective work, being responsive to the topic today. And then I'll ask each speaker one question, and here I'll be a bit flexible if I find that the speakers go over, not that I anticipate that. Then I may skip the one question and open it up to the audience, because I think the engagement back and forth with the audience is always the best part of these discussions. So before I introduce our speakers, if you'll just humor me for a second, I'll take license to editorialize a bit on the title of today's talk and then try to inject the voices of people who have largely been silenced in these discussions. And that's the role that we play at Just Leadership USA, so I'll just speak for a minute or two to inject their voices into this discussion, particularly as someone myself who grew up in a community that reflects the discussion we're having, and as someone who served 6 years in prison before I started doing this work 13 years ago. When I was invited to moderate the panel, I was a little bit struck by the title, particularly with respect to the emerging consensus part of the title. I immediately wondered who are we talking about, who is coming to that consensus? And while there appears to be increasing bipartisan political support for doing something different, arguably communities most impacted have yet to experience the fruits of this newfound movement, if you will, or moment, depending on where you are in defining where we are, and are increasingly expressing their frustration with feeling left out of the work to reform this system. At Just Leadership USA, we believe that people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution and yet furthest from power and resources. So as I travel the country, people from these communities have articulated to me their belief that systems that are oppressive tend to be pretty durable and tend to reinvent themselves if the problem is not defined by those being oppressed by the system, and if Americans don't finally admit that we made a mistake. So as I would say to our speakers, as each of you give your remarks, please think about this question of the inclusion of people in communities most impacted, particularly as we move into the Q&A section of the talk. So I'll start by introducing Jeremy Travis to my right, the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the chair of the National Academy of Sciences panel. The panel produced a comprehensive report on mass incarceration. If you haven't gotten a copy of the report, you might want to back your truck up to the front of the building and we'll put one in it. It's about this thick. But there are digestible versions of it, actually. I've read the entire thing twice. So the panel produced this comprehensive report on mass incarceration and explored the causes of high rates of incarceration, as well as the consequences and costs. I should point out that Heather and Glenn were both members of the NSA panel, and I'm hoping that Jeremy will talk a bit about community harm as both at the neighborhood level and at the societal level. Heather Thompson, to my left, is professor of history at the University of Michigan as of 2 weeks from now or ago? 2 weeks from now. Heather has worked for years on broader issues of incarceration, sort of how we got here, if you will. Today I'm hoping she'll focus on violence, especially the relationship between traditional criminal justice system mechanisms, especially mass incarceration and violence in inner city communities. I think this makes sense given her October 30th, 2014 piece in The Atlantic, I remember because it was my birthday, called Inner City Violence in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And then Glenn Lowry, to her left, who is the professor of economics at Brown University, who will talk about the economic and social costs of communities, to communities, of the traditional criminal justice system, hopefully, and particularly the way that those costs extend beyond the individual who is convicted of a crime or an offense or having been arrested. And then last but not least, Tim Dunn, who is the CEO of Crown Quest Operating. And I hope he'll share his perspective based on his work with a group that I'm very familiar with and have worked with, Right on Crime, and the criminal justice reforms that focus on repairing relationships between victims in particular and perpetrators of crimes and their communities. So I think a couple of our panelists may be using PowerPoints or no? Okay, Glenn?
I was planning to, yes.
Yeah, so we do have your PowerPoint queued up if you want to use it. You guys can feel free to stand at the podium if it makes more sense. But we'll go in the order that I introduced you from right to left, my right to my left. So Jeremy first, please.
And if it's okay, I'll sit, just to keep it relatively informal. So first I want to say welcome to all of you again to John Jay, if you're just now coming here, and just to say personally how very exciting it is to see that the National Network has taken off and taken on these big topics under a very big umbrella of the mission statement of the National Network. It's just wonderful to see that this forum exists, that this way to collect people of goodwill exists for us to come together and talk about things that are important to our country. So I'll agree with Glenn that the emerging consensus part of our subtitle of our panel title raises at least these eyebrows. I'm not quite sure where it is, but I just it can take a long time to emerge. You know, so it could be a long process. But I do hope that this conversation is part of helping us understand the idea of excuse me, criminal justice system and community harm as being linked concepts. A system that causes harm in the name of justice. So that's the paradox that we live in, that we have to really start to come to grips with. So in thinking about how to organize my thoughts today, I wanted to focus on three levels of understanding that connection, knowing full well that my colleagues may very well take up one or more of these as their themes, so I don't intend in any way to either preempt or just describe the whole domain here. But the first is to talk about the phenomenon of communities that are, now because it's some sort of a buzzword, not one of my making, but under-policed and over-policed and underprotected. So this notion that we have a policing system as implemented in cities around the country in particular that can do too much and too little at the same time. I just want to return to that. Secondly, to talk about mass incarceration and what in our report we called the footprint of the justice system. Another phrase that we used in the National Academy report was that the prisons had become a pillar of injustice rather than a pillar of justice. So I want to talk about that a little bit and reflect a bit on Glenn's work and the Cut 50 movement, which is very much alive in our country and very exciting. And then take a step back and acknowledge here that my thinking is very much informed by our colleague on the panel here, Glenn Lowry. So again, I want to acknowledge that these are ideas that come from many sources, but one is to talk about, the impact of our approach to justice on our democracy. So community has many meanings, and harm has many meanings, and one way, and the justice system has many manifestations. So just to try to deconstruct this a little bit might be a helpful contribution I can make. So let's go to the first one. So this is the New York City story. So it'll play out in different ways in different cities. The commissioner mentioned it this morning that for many years we in the city ramped up a legally permissible police tactic known as a Terry stop or a reasonable suspicion stop to a very high level of incidents measured in these forms that are kept by police officers who stop people, to the point where we had close to 700,000 individual stops a year in the base of 100,000 or fewer. So the justification given for that practice was that this was a good thing for the community. It was saving lives, it was reducing crime, and that it was a not just permissible, but a laudable crime prevention measure. So we're now at a different place. We now have brought that down, as Bratton mentioned this morning, significantly. It's now probably 45 or 50,000 stops this year. And you have to ask how that happened. How did we come to that point where not long ago the debate was whether this is or isn't a good crime control strategy? And how do we think about this using the frame of harm as opposed to benefit, cost as opposed to benefit, a way of trying to understand the reflex that led us to that point. Now, other cities have been through something similar. Philadelphia, the Mayor Nutter ran for election on a promise to increase stop and frisk. So it's been a very explicit part of our conversation. So we can look at this through the lens of the law, which is what ultimately happened in our federal district court here, where a judge said that practice is unconstitutional, not just in the individual application of the Terry stop, but in the policy framework that led to hundreds of thousands of them, that violated the 14th Amendment. So that's one way to think about it, is that at some point the harm is a constitutional harm. Right? It's not just a harm to individuals, it's a violation of the Constitution. It also led to a robust political debate that I think most people would agree led to the election of our current mayor, who said that the era of stop and frisk must end, that there was something wrong with it. But I want to just suggest that we need other ways to think about community harm beyond the constitutional violation and beyond the political rhetoric, which is to think about the way in which certain practices, and this one in our city, and I want to mention some others, run the risk of undermining the basic legitimacy of the police and the respect for the rule of law. So community harm can be seen as harming the relationship between citizen and state. That's sort of the theme I want to develop here. That we have something very precious called the relationship between the state, the government, and citizens, and that relationship needs to be understood as being very important to the well-being of our democracy, and that certain police tactics, even if justified or even if empirically demonstrated to be effective, have a potential for harm. We don't measure that harm. We don't think about that harm. We don't talk about that harm. But at the individual level, that harm can be very pernicious and aggregated to lots of people experiencing that harm of loss of trust, loss of respect for the enforcement of the law, and therefore for the law, can be very detrimental to our democracy. So what happened, I think, in New York, it's my own personal observation, is that we had a discussion that focused on the Constitution, focused on legalities, focused on crime prevention assertions that turned out not to be true. But it was very hard for us to really get a grip on the harm. But what happened, in a political sense, was that people marched in the streets, right? Down Fifth Avenue, including our mayor, now our mayor, because the harm became to such a level and so personally experienced that people said, we're not going to allow that to be our city. We're not going to be policed that way. So this puts stop and frisk to one side, bring up in your mind the Ferguson realities, the Justice Department report, where part of the harm that was documented by the Justice Department was the harm of lots of low-level enforcement, in this case to generate revenue, targeted, not targeted, but I want to assert intentionality here, but the recipients of which were mostly people of color in Ferguson. And the harm came to the point where people disassociated from the politics of the city, that the ability to elect people of color to the city council was damaged, I would argue. and that the faith in the enforcement of the law was undermined. So we need to have ways going forward to think about how to measure community harm by this notion of over-policing. Now, there's another community harm that we need to also have a better understanding of, and many of the speakers mentioned it this morning, which is the notion of underprotected community. Violence rates too high. People allowed to engage in behaviors that should not be tolerated. People growing up in environments where the socialization process doesn't result in somebody who is engaged in pro-social activity. And we have to ask, what's the role of police? What's the role of government? What's the role of faith communities? What's the role of everybody in identifying the young people early on, so that we don't wait till they're so old that we incarcerate them for the rest of their lives to say, you've done something that we really don't like. And the nature of violence in inner city neighborhoods often results in the thin line between those who are harmed, those who are causing harm, victims and offenders. And we need a way that I know at least Danielle Serrett is here thinking about with people at OJP and elsewhere about how to really come to grips with the need for protection. I'm not saying police is the answer, but for protection of young people in a very different way. This is the President's My Brother's Keeper initiative. So we need to sort of have both a deeper focus and a broader focus at the same time. Second category. We talked in the National Academy report, which you can download for free, Glenn. You don't have to buy the $70 book. There have been 10,000 downloads of our book, by the way, fellow panelists, which we're very proud. Fourth most frequently downloaded report in the National Academy of Sciences history. So there's something going on here. So we talked about the footprint of incarceration. So I want to broaden that a bit because I think that's almost too easy. It's the footprint of the justice system. It's the penetration of the justice system. Police, parole, probation, pretrial, arrest into particularly communities of color is unprecedented. In the presence of a historian, I always hesitant to say unprecedented in a nation's history, and Heather will come back and say, well, in 1820 they did something. I don't know, she'll probably correct me, but it's unprecedented in the modern era. For this to be the experience of growing up, particularly as a young man of color, that you have these frequent interactions, negative and harmful interactions with the justice system, that you have family who are at the level, we have people under supervision, we have dads who are sent back to prison. This is unprecedented. So one of the statistics in our report that you'll recognize if you read it carefully or twice is that in the era of mass incarceration, catch this, just write this one down, a African-American high school male dropout has a 68% chance of serving at least a year in prison. 68, it used to be at 14.7% chance before the era of mass incarceration. So we have come to a place where the realities of incarceration are so pervasive, and the entire justice system is so pervasive, that you can only say, what is it we have done in the name of justice, right? That is the irony. So the community harm, we document it in 5 chapters of the book, with the families and labor markets and the like. So the footprint of the justice system, the penetration of, I've used lots of different metaphors here. It's very hard to get this across. We've never been here before. And guess what? We chose to be here. This is not because of crime rates. This is not because something terrible happened with private prisons. Everyone wants to blame private prisons. They're terrible, but that's not who we got. Through our democracy, we got here. We elected people who promised this, and they delivered. Mass incarceration is ours. We've got to own it. So the harm at the community level, which we have to come to grips with, and the Academy report does, but people live it. People have to talk about it. We need to elevate those voices. That harm is our shame as a country. We have to come to grips with having created this reality. So the Cut 50 movement, Van Jones, Glenn. I was just in Germany last week with Shaka. There are people, Luke Gingrich, my new buddy, right? People who are saying we've got to cut. Why are they saying this? Okay, maybe it's expensive, but it's really inconsistent with our national values. That's what we have to do. So the harm here is really something deeper than, or in addition to the harm to community, it's really harm to our sense of national self. So let me just end on that note and just say a couple things. So the era of mass incarceration has lots of consequences we document in the report. We also say we've gone too far. We also say we've chosen to be here. We do the whole analysis of the legislative enactments that got us here. The bottom line of all of that is in order to, if democracy brought us here, our democracy has to get us out of here. So this is the time for, in essence, political organizing. And for finding brave governors, brave legislators, brave whoever who's going to stand up and say, this is not consistent with our heritage, it's not consistent with our values. So I want to just talk about the impact on our democracy in the following way. We know that lots of people can't vote. That's terrible. We know that lots of people are shut out of big sectors of the workforce. That's terrible. We know that lots of people sort of lose their sense of identity. That having been incarcerated, people are more likely to distance themselves from civic life. We know that parents have been lost, children lose touch with their parents and siblings. All of that documented nicely. But I want to focus my final comments on the following. We have lost connection to some very basic jurisprudential principles that define who we are. So there are four. This is chapter 12 of the book. It's the most important chapter. We've lost a sense of proportionality. Why is America so punitive? Why have we come to the point where we just drop tons of bricks on people for things that they did when they were 18 and they're in prison for the rest of their life? I just came back from Germany. Study trip of 20 of us. In Germany, the Constitutional Court said you cannot be in solitary longer than 4 weeks. We have people in solitary for years. What happened to our sense of proportionality? That's a legal principle. That's a democratic principle that we have lost touch of. We don't observe anymore. Second principle, very important, is the principle of parsimony. This is a libertarian principle. That's why I love hanging out with libertarians, because they get this. Libertarians understand, as we all should understand as Americans, that there's a limit on what the state can do. There's a limit on the power of the state that we should impose on the government. And it goes like this. You can't impose pain on one of our citizens beyond that necessary to achieve a reasonable government purpose. That's a principle. It's in the model penal code. It's the least restrictive alternative. You can't go beyond that, we say to our government, in our name. You can't hurt one of us in our name beyond that reasonably required. So that's a principle that we lost sight of. We need to use that language. The third one is the principle of citizenship. So here I was in Germany, and they talked about the citizenship of those incarcerated. They're all addressed by Mr. They wear their street clothes. The strongest image to me walking into a man's cell was of a metal spaghetti fork hanging on his cell. He's a long-term detainee, which means less than 10 years. I said, why does he have a metal? My first reaction was security risk. That could be a shoe. Why? How is that allowed? Well, it's allowed because they try to normalize life on the inside and on the outside. But why a spaghetti spoon? I asked my tour guide. He says because he goes next door and he cooks dinner whenever he wants to have spaghetti with his friends, because he can buy spaghetti in the commissary with the money he earns in the shop. It's citizenship. We've lost that idea. People are citizens forever. And the final one is social justice. So the fourth principle that we need to really pay attention to is the social justice principle, which is this notion that every institution of our society should promote the goals of our society. Education, healthcare, and prison. Prisons should not so diminish one segment of our society. People from poor communities, people of color, people who are struggling, mentally ill, should not so diminish their ability to participate in our society that we diminish our ability to achieve social justice, racial justice, and justice. So the harm caused is not just at a community level, individual level, it's really to our democracy. And the sooner we get a handle on that and start doing something about it, the better off the country will be. So let's do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. We'll move right along to Heather.
So, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you, it's not afternoon yet? Like, please, I hope it's not morning still. So thank you all for having me here. I want to really thank the National Network for bringing us all together. I think this is an incredibly important discussion, and I hope to not bring it down to the level of boring because I'm a history professor up here. and I hope to keep in Jeremy's spirit of relevancy. I think my job on this panel was to really bring some historical perspective on how we really how we got into this mess, but more specifically how discussions about crime and violence reduction can be infused with a sense of where we've been before, what we've done before that hasn't worked, what we've done before that might have worked. And actually, after listening this morning to all the speakers, I realized that I can actually do something a little better, I think, than just bring some perspective, which is to actually bring some affirmation and hope, particularly regarding the instincts that all of us as part of the National Network have for how we might change this. The various recommendations that I've heard this morning, the various programs that people are already engaged in, that we actually have a lot of ammunition behind that, beyond just even studies and evidence-based principles, but we actually have some sort of larger historical moments and shifts that I think really affirm what we're doing. So in short, what I want to say to you is that that history can really do three things for us. First of all, it can very much help us to explain how we got here, how we got into the crisis that Jeremy just described. It also very much confirms why it is imperative that we intervene in this crisis and change directions. And again, as I just said, I think history very much affirms the direction that many of us here gathered today are going in when it comes to implementing change. So first of all, how history helps to explain how we got here. This is a very complicated story, and again, I refer to the National Academy's report that Jeremy's mentioned a few times. There is a longer version of this in Chapter 4, but in short, as Jeremy points out, we actually chose this. And that's a really important point of departure as we imagine going forward, because it would be one thing if we had to do this and then we ended up in a mess. It's entirely another thing if we chose it. So we began a war on crime for political reasons, not for reasons of historically remarkable crime rates. In short, we made this policy choice to solve social ills through a criminal justice apparatus at a moment of intense civil rights activism in this country. And indeed, as the civil rights movement moved from the South to the North in the mid-1960s, actually late 50s to early 1960s, even though the murder rate was actually quite unremarkable, had been much higher in the 20s and 30s, for example, Northern and most importantly, federal politicians began to speak the language of Southern politicians that they'd long been speaking, which is that disorder and crime were synonymous, that disruption and crime were synonymous. And we indeed chose a language of crime fighting that manifested itself in an enormous bureaucracy that we've never seen before for waging a war on crime. Now, history is important because it shows that we've done this also in another moment in history, not quite on this scale, but for example, after the American Civil War, when we had 4 million newly freed people, Southern politicians, and I spent 12 years in the South, this is not aspersions on the South, this is just a historical fact, literally responded to this new status of freedom by changing the laws, by making new things crimes that had not been crimes before, by making pre-existing crimes have far greater penalties. And we watched in states like Georgia, where the penitentiary went from being 100% white to almost 100% black within 20 years. Again, not because blacks lost their mind and whites stopped committing crimes, but because it was a political decision. It was a policy choice. And we can see from moments like that then or like this now that the consequences of those policy choices were devastating. Back then, back after the Civil War, we now know as historians that the consequences of having locked up so many newly freed African Americans were lifelong devastating and generationally devastating, right? That it literally prevented people from participating in freedom and participating in what abolition, what the end of slavery should have meant. More recently, we know from all that Jeremy has said, from what Glenn has reminded us to ask people who've experienced it to tell us, that this has also been devastating. The destruction of neighborhoods, the orphaning of children, the wholesale and permanent unemployability of populations, and also, and this is really important, I was mentioning democracy, Jeremy mentioned democracy, also a very serious distortion of our democracy, so that the people most affected by this, the people that experience this most directly, are largely barred from what we would consider the most traditional mechanisms of changing it, right? Both through disfranchisement, but also through prison gerrymandering and other policy decisions. So we've distorted our democracy. The costs of this have been devastating, and others of us on the panel will talk about this. But one of the costs about this that brings us all here today has been violence. This kind of intensification and escalation of violence in communities that are already the most fragile, already the most marginalized. And we see that this intensification of violence also has some historical roots that we can think about, we can look at, and we can see. Let me first say, though, one of the sort of long-standing explanations, and indeed it's a kind of a popular media explanation for why there's this kind of rise in violence in particularly highly incarcerated communities, is because, you know, there's a lot of poverty there, and there's high rates of segregation there. And of course that's true, but what historians can tell you is that those are actually kind of baseline in American history. We have had intense poverty generationally and for decades and time immemorial in American history. We've also had a pretty horrendous history of segregation. But it's only been in some moments that we see the joining of those things with these intense levels of violence that most victimize the people who are already most suffering poverty and segregation. And one of the things that happens to do that is when communities are hyper-criminalized, over-policed, and intensely incarcerated. And we know this not just because of the studies we're all doing and the experiences of our own communities and where we live, but we know this also historically, and that'll just be the last thing I want to leave you with until we have some discussion. Again, history is instructive. The last time we saw this jump up in intensive violence in very contained communities among people who were already living on the margins, that is to say, already experiencing poverty, already experiencing these things we've talked about, was Prohibition. And it doesn't take a PhD in history to tell you things that are pretty obvious if you just spent any Saturday night watching Boardwalk Empire on HBO. What we know is that when we make a community particularly criminalized, we immediately do all kinds of things that create harm. Particularly, we create violence. And we know that this is true. We know that during Prohibition, that some of the worst violence in this country was between 1920 and 1933, which was the high point of Prohibition. We know that communities, very specific communities, were highly policed and highly imprisoned as a result of Prohibition. This was also very racialized, and it was also very class stratified. Then, as in now, the racial composition was a little bit more complicated then. For example, the Irish were intensely policed, but still were African Americans. The imprisonment rate was never what it is now. Jeremy's right that where we are today is completely unprecedented, but the pattern we saw before, which was destroying communities, taking people out of their communities, eroding families. Very notably, we do not treat addiction through any kind of public policy until 1935 when we start Alcoholics Anonymous, because we had made a decision to criminalize addiction. We had made a decision to criminalize spaces where we assumed addiction would be most flourishing. But guess what? We didn't police the upper class places where alcohol was flowing freely. We know that even in watching Boardwalk Empire. We didn't police everybody equally. We didn't intensify criminalization equally. And the consequences of this were pretty perhaps obvious, but worth remembering, that violence intensified in the communities that were most criminalized with regard to a public policy decision. Gun violence in particular skyrocketed, because when you make something illegal, you make it something that you have to protect, and all other jobs dry up. Remember, at this time it was the Great Depression, eventually at the high point. But again, already marginalized communities. It just is notable, and I'll leave you with this statistic. In a study done at the time of 30 major US cities during the Prohibition years, just between 1920 and 21, so when this just all gets started, the number of crimes as counted then increased by 24%. Theft and burglaries by 9%, homicides by 12.7%, and assaults and batteries by 13%. And interestingly, drug addiction by 44.6%. In the most intensely criminalized, policed, and policy-focused communities. And again, police department costs rose. You know, the cost of waging this war on a substance were staggering. And we get the rise of gangs, and we get a lot of community devastation. Now, we don't have time to unpack here the differences between Prohibition or today, or the drug war and a war on alcohol, or whether or not we should legalize drugs as we made alcohol eventually legal. I think there's a lot of differences. I'm not here to say they're the same. But what I am here to suggest is that we can use history in a very instrumental way as we all go out and try to figure out how to do this differently. And we can also use history to see what absolutely did not work before, what absolutely was guaranteed to create community harm, devastation, orphan children, create unemployability, all of the things that we see today. You know, we just have to figure out a way to do it differently the next time so that hopefully we don't repeat it. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We'll move on now to Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Heather. And I can't wait to hear what Tim is going to say. Okay, so I have this big presentation here that I gave just a couple of days ago because it has like 3 slides in it that I want to show you. But the title is worth dwelling on for just a moment. I think I have 10 minutes here, so I'm just going to take like 15 seconds. What is a self-respecting black intellectual to do in the face of persistent racial inequality? So we're supposed to be talking about community harms from incarceration. So one dimension of that is the racial aspect of it. I'm going to address myself to that. I'm the self-respecting black intellectual in the title there, and what will a college professor do but engage in studies and collect data, which is what I've done. But I can get damned mad about it if I feel that a grave injustice is being perpetrated on our watch. And if I have a megaphone and have an ability to express my thoughts about that, then that's a useful expenditure of my time, in my view. And that's the spirit in which I come before you. I basically have 3 points, okay? Beyond belief, beyond colorblind, and beyond justice. Let me unpack that. The scale of what we've undertaken is beyond belief. Let me get to the main point here. This is based on data from the National Research Council study that Jeremy chaired and that Heather and I participated in. And it simply makes the point that what has gone on in the United States since 1970 in terms of the expansion, the transformation of our incarceration institutions is unprecedented. Unprecedented in our own history and unprecedented in international experience. That's not going to be a new fact, but I think it's still worth pointing out here at the outset. These are US incarceration rates per 100,000 in the population over the course of the 20th century. You see the line creeping along there more or less constant at just a little bit over 100 per 100,000. That's about 0.1% of the population until we get to the end of the 1960s. And that's what the historical series looks like thereafter. As I say, a complete break with the precedent of our own historical experience. This is what incarceration looks like early in the 21st century in a variety of countries in Northern Europe, advanced and wealthy countries like the United States. As you can see there, with the United Kingdom leading the pack, the rates are not dissimilar from those which we saw in the United States earlier in the 20th century. This is what the US looked like in that same year. As I say, beyond belief, in the sense of without precedent either in international comparative context or in the context of our own history. Beyond colorblind, okay? For the cohort of Americans born in the late 1940s, here's a breakdown of incarceration rates by race and by education level. Okay? Dropouts didn't finish high school. You have the whites to the left and the blacks to the right. You can see that there's a racial disparity with, for example, African-American dropouts about 14.7% being incarcerated in a given year for that cohort born in the late 1940s. I should say, experiencing incarceration before they reach the age of 35. Okay, that's what's being measured there. That was the cohort born in the late 1940s, my cohort, as it happens. Here is the cohort born in the late 1970s, and what you can see there, and Jeremy mentioned it, is that for high school dropouts who are African American, over 2/3 of them will have experienced a year or more in a state or federal institution before reaching the age of 35. It's a normative experience for them. Beyond colorblind. Now, there are a couple of ways we can react to that. Oh, there must be racism somewhere if we've got this kind of racial disparity, to which the criminologists may respond by saying, yes, well, we've checked the data, and it looks like the black offending rates are also quite high. So perhaps we can account for this in that way. Perhaps you can. But here's my point. you've way overshot, okay? As President Travis has said, we're in a cul-de-sac here. We've gone way beyond the point where we could justify what we're doing based on our own principles. Why didn't you pull back? Why didn't you pull back? Is it because the people who were suffering most of the depredations of you having overshot were people of color? I can't prove that. I don't know that to be true. But it is a nagging suspicion in the back of my mind that one reason that policy reform has not taken root until this late date is that the people who were subject to the worst costs of our overindulgence in incarceration as a matter of social policy didn't have much of a voice or account in the political process. Again, I can't prove that. Beyond belief, beyond colorblind, beyond justice. Okay, so here I'm going to make 2 points. I only have a few minutes. Crime has root causes. People embedded in social structures will have their behavior affected by what's going on around them. Poverty is criminogenic. Concentrated urban poverty is criminogenic. Cities with communities that are on the wrong side of the tracks, that are underinvested in, overpoliced and underprotected, cities that are communities that are stigmatized and excluded are going to be more prone to criminal offending. Saying this is merely stating a social scientific fact. It's not exculpatory. It doesn't excuse anybody. There's a difference between individual responsibility and social responsibility. Justice involves both. Justice involves bringing the offender before the bar and causing him or her to face the consequences of their actions. That is justice. But that doesn't exhaust the discussion about justice. 1 million cases, each one rightly decided, can still add up to a great and historic wrong. Criminalizing entire communities, communities where the schools don't work, communities where the jobs have fled, communities where all of the resourceful neighbors have moved someplace else, criminalizing them and responding to them with a one-note response, a punitive response, is not justice, rightly understood. So I have other data to show, but they would only be underscoring the main points that I have made. Here you just see a series showing the level of incarceration broken down by race. The red bar are African Americans, the blue are whites, if I'm not mistaken. I can't see the slide from here. And the green would be Latino. But in any case, as you can see there, a massive growth in incarceration. And a big part of that growth has been in the numbers of African Americans who are in prison. Drug wars played an important part in that. But I don't have time to discuss that. But I did want to talk about the impact on public health and the impact on families. What we're doing has costs for people. Even for people who break the law, those costs should count in our reckoning with whether or not the benefits outweigh them. That is, breaking the law doesn't mean that you're no longer human. And a decent society will attempt to assess its welfare by referring to the well-being of all of those people. But what about those who are connected to the offenders by social and psychic affiliation? They too bear cost from the policies that we've undertaken. These economists tried to study the impact of incarceration on racial differences in the incidence of the HIV virus. I cannot give the detail, but I'll just give you the bottom line. That graph shows over time the rate of new HIV infections broken down by race. The top bar is blacks. This graph shows the difference between that top bar reproduced there, the racial difference in incidence of new infections, and the bottom bar, which is a prediction based on their data of what the racial difference would have been if you controlled for the differences in exposure to incarceration. They're attempting to show here that incarceration has played a first-order impact in exacerbating the racial difference in the incidence of new HIV infections because of what goes on in prisons and the fact that what happens in San Quentin doesn't stay in San Quentin. People are rotating in and out, in and out, in and out. The wall between the community and the prison is porous. Viruses can cross that wall. One more thing. Who's incarcerated? The most disadvantaged people in our society. Incarceration is social policy by other means. It is one way of responding to that disadvantage. It is a primary way in which we have chosen to respond. It is not the only way that we might respond. So these are data, somewhat dated, from 2004, federal and state prison populations, just doing a basic census of how much education and other aspects of a person's profile who's a prisoner. What you can see there is that 2/3 of state prisoners in 2004 had less than a high school education. They're the least educated population in our society. Again, I can't read the slide, but you can. And those are the fractions of inmates in state prisons who suffered from various maladies, diabetes, kidney, but you see them. Here is also, I think, mental health. Again, I can't see the slide. People with problems with alcohol or with drugs, people with schizophrenia, people with manic depressive disorder, things of this kind. Those numbers are huge. Again, I can't see them here, but you can. Okay, so let me conclude. I think the principles that Jeremy was enunciating at the outset, proportionality, parsimony, and citizenship, well encapsulate my own view. The policy has, the extent of the punitiveness of our policy has not been proportional to the social harm of offense. It certainly has not been parsimonious in the sense that we've overshot. The quality of citizenship for a non-trivial part and the most disadvantaged part of our population has been severely compromised by the policies that we have adopted. Fortunately, there seems to be a great deal of energy in both sides of the political spectrum for trying to move away from those policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. And again, last but not least, Tim, please.
Probably least. I have a different hat on today. I'm not an expert in this subject. I'm a layman. I'm basically an investor. So I've been on the board of the conservative policy think tank in Texas called the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And about 10 years ago, we launched an effort we call the Center for Effective Justice that has bloomed into a national movement now in 33 states called Right on Crime. And what I want to do is just talk about the story of how that happened. And I will defend the title of our panel here a little bit and to say that when a green leaf pokes through the ground, you can say it's an emerging plant. So what I see happening from my sort of spectator position is there's a very significant change that's taken place in the criminal justice movement. I can understand if it's your livelihood and your life, you'd be very frustrated with the pace. But I think something very material has happened, and that is that there's a consensus that's arrived that what we're doing now is really dumb and it's not working and we need to do something else. That's a really good start. Let me just say that the national network is brilliant for a number of reasons, which means everybody in here is brilliant for being here. But it's brilliant for a number of reasons, and one of the reasons is it's systemic. So this is a system. This is not a singular cause-effect event. It's a whole system. And while the police enforcing is part of the system, so are the civil statutes and the funding mechanisms. And that's the area where my work is done, where Texas Public Policy is focused, and that is in legislation, in the legislative arena. Because another thing that in the national network is brilliant about is it understands the importance of culture, and you're after culture change. Well, there's a lot that goes into culture, but one of the things that affects culture are the financial incentives that are set up, and that's typically legislative in nature. Another one is what data is collected. You know, in any human organization, you tend to get what you measure. And so these systemic understandings are difficult to come to, but if you really want true change, that's the approach you have to have. And the third reason the national network is brilliant is because it focuses on story. I've heard it many times today, and that's the area I'm going to camp on here, is the importance of story. David Kennedy and his seminal work, which has made a huge impact on a lot of people that I personally know, really documented the underlying causal motivation of two groups, the police and the community, who told themselves different stories about what was happening. And these stories were in total contradiction, and they actually both were untrue. Well, I know about this. Again, I'm kind of an investor, and I'm in the oil business. We invest in oil and gas properties. It's the easiest place to lose money that you can ever imagine. It's a very difficult way to make a living. And so we study investment psychology. And if you like this arena, Daniel Kahneman has a fantastic body of work on this. And one of the things that we do as humans that causes bad decision making is we take in data and incorporate it into an existing story that we're telling ourselves instead of examining it for what it is. That's just what we do. It's basically automatic. And so unless these stories are examined, they will be determinative. Well, so here's what was going on in Texas. There had become this story that we told ourselves, and I think it came out of this history that you talked about, Heather, that said the way to have safe streets is to lock a bunch of people up, throw away the key, and then you'll have safe streets. Well, all of these untrue stories have a basis to stand on, don't they? That's factually true. If you lock everyone up, the streets would be completely safe because there would be no one on them. That's not what we really want, though. What we really want is great communities. I love safe communities. I suppose, Jeremy, you didn't say vibrant communities because it wouldn't be specific enough, but safe communities lead to vibrant communities. It's a precondition. And so I went to the president of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a wonderful human being named Brooke Rollins. And I sat down. I had been studying the works of Chuck Colson on restorative justice and discovered that his organization was really was working in individual lives, but wasn't really working to change the system that was causing the damage to the individual lives. So I went to her and said, you know, we as conservatives believe in limited government. We believe that government ought to do its proper job and nothing else. It ought to do its assigned functions. And the most critical of all those functions is criminal justice. And we're not paying any attention to it. And furthermore, the system we have stinks. It's not working. So we need to be the leaders in doing this. And God bless her. She immediately said, that's absolutely right. We have to do this. Now, we're going into an environment where, again, the dominant narrative is more people in jail and safer streets. So to launch into this and say, that's actually, you know, a dumb idea was a little bit brave. But we launched it, and as chance would have it, we happened to go right into an arena in a time when the legislature was asking, why do we spend $1 billion on building prisons every year? Is this ever going to stop? And Mark Levin, who has run the Center for Effective Justice, waded into that arena and said, yes, it can stop. Do these diversions instead. We have data here that demonstrates it'll be more effective and you don't have to spend all this money. And I'm glad to say that although the population of Texas continues to explode over the last 10 years, we've actually not only not built any prisons, we've shut down 9 prisons. I'm sorry.
That was applause.
I didn't mean it. So, you know, it's a small start, but it's a start. It's changing the direction of the aircraft carrier, you know, just beginning to go. And I think that it's going to continue to be important, Jeremy, to develop these stories. What is it we're trying to do as a people? You can turn it off, and I'll amp up my. I'll pull in my diaphragm here for my last few comments, if you want me to. My personal message that I. It's really. Can you just turn it off? You have to have it for the broadcast. No. Well, maybe what I ought to do is just stop.
Do you have a solution? Are you coming here for a solution? You turn it off. Okay.
I think it's maybe the mic. Mic's fine.
Maybe finish with the mic in front of you.
There you go. Yeah, that's a
Have my
we want those.
an encore. I can't remember what I was going to say. No, I think my personal sort of encouragement that I give to people that I have influence with, and that's all you can work with, right? It's people that you have influence with, is that when we talk about justice, that is an enormously important topic, and it is foundational to our culture. Plato's Republic asks the question, what is justice, and answers it. The biblical letter of Paul, the Apostle Paul to the Romans, asks the questions, what is justice, and how do we get it, and what does it look like? It's foundational. And this Greek word dikaiosune is in the Bible usually translated righteousness. It's a word we don't use much anymore. But what it really boils down to, what Plato answers in his work on the Republic, is what justice is when everybody in the city-state does what they do best so that everyone benefits the most. And what the Apostle Paul concludes is righteousness is something, or justice is something that happens in the heart. And it's when we choose to take our gifts and benefit others with our gifts, and we do it in a way that is not self-serving but serves a greater cause. Okay, that's what justice is. It's personal and it's communal. So when we, in the conservative movement, what I'm trying to advance is the notion of we should be social reformers. We tend to shy from that notion because we're conservative. But what we should do is advance, we the people of the United States, and we should make those principles. When they're not happening, we should stand up and say, enough, let's change it. And I see progress. I wish it was faster. Thank you.
Let's see if the mic works for me. It was your magnetic personality, Tim. So I definitely want to quickly open it up to questions from the audience. I'll just try to summarize some of what we heard. And I was going to summarize each, but I'll just summarize themes across all four presentations. I think one is that we chose to be here, that it was a set of political decisions, and as Jeremy always says, our democracy got us here, and our democracy can get us out of here. I think that's a pretty empowering statement, one that we should hold on to. We talked about the consequences, both statutory and practical, and the costs of where we've arrived in terms of mass incarceration and the punishment that stems from being convicted of a crime. We definitely, rightfully so, talked about race and class across the presentations. But we also talked about this important point of weighing individual responsibility versus societal responsibility. Jeremy talked about community harm versus what seems to be our addiction to punishment, and then Tim followed the theme when he talked about Plato's Republic and keeping an eye on the greater cause. Each speaker talked about how unprecedented that we ended up here, whether in the international context or the historical context. And then Tim wound us up with this idea of the importance of storytelling and the importance of narratives. And in that frame, I'd just like to tell a really brief story before I open it up to the audience. Last week, I had a chance to be at the White House. I don't know if anyone in this room was with me. I definitely saw a couple of people downstairs when we had lunch. And it was after a long conversation with about 50 of my colleagues around the country about policing, mass incarceration, and gun violence, a great conversation. And as we walked into the White House, everyone else got this green ID, and I got a pink ID that said escort only. And I got stuck downstairs for 20 minutes, pretty embarrassing, pretty oppressive, pretty dehumanizing, waiting to get into the White House. And then when I got into the White House, of course, used that to set the context for the rest of our conversation. Except for me, it really stood out as my measure of where we are as a country on this issue. I think we're going to be moving forward on this issue when we no longer have a conservative movement and a progressive movement, but when we have an American movement. And on that note, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Right here, please. Can I get you to just stand up and say your name? I'll try to repeat it.
Wait for the microphone.
I'm sorry, yeah, there's a mic coming. There you go.
Geraldine A.G., Birmingham, Alabama. Was it pink because you've been?
Yes, because I've been
okay.
incarcerated,
Okay.
correct. Questions? There you go.
Hi, John from Illinois. I got a quick comment and then a question. So I was following the Marshall Project's reports on President Travis's trip to Germany and and I'm thinking about some of your comments, Jeremy. And I'm wondering, if that kind of speaks to the moment we're in. It seems that in places like Germany, what you're seeing is kind of the outcome of their human rights moment, right? Germany had the Holocaust, and I think Europe had the Holocaust and had to contend with that. I think our human rights moment was probably after the Civil War, and we squandered it. And it seems like we might be caught in a kind of repetition until we really contend with what human rights mean in that kind of governmental context. It's just a thought I wanted to throw out. But the other thing I wanted to press President Travis on a bit is measuring the harm of punishment. And so I've been thinking recently that, there's a way in which we're wrong to think, or it's not quite right to think punishment's about individuals, well, that's what we focus on, that punishment's always already about the community context, right? Punishment makes sense because it's about a community. And so punishment, so I'm from Chicago. Someone in my neighborhood being sent to Chicago, to prison on the north side of Chicago would be very, very different from someone being sent to prison on the south or west side of Chicago. And I'm wondering, if there's ways we can get back to a more kind of, measured. So for example, like when a judge sends someone to prison, if he or she as part of their disposition would say, I'm going to send you to prison even though you have a child and I know that I'm putting your child at risk to go to prison. Even though I know if you're a mother, you're the only parent, and you're the breadwinner, and that's going to do irreparable harm to your family, to your community. So I guess what I'm asking is, are there concrete ways in which we can build measurement into our system of punishment and use that to influence policy?
There we go. Hello, John. Let me just take a moment to the week in Germany, and there'll be lots written about this, and you'll see it on TV and like. But the week in Germany was really pretty profound. And one of the things that you come away with from such an experience is the power in Germany and other continental systems of the human rights ideal. So in the first article of the Constitution of Germany, which was, by the way, written for them at the insistence of the Americans, has a very powerful embodiment of the notion of human dignity. That's what government is here to protect the dignity of its citizens. So the Constitutional Court, their Supreme Court, has exercised enormous influence over the way the criminal justice system is operated by applying that principle to the operations of the justice system. And what you find when we visited 5 or 6 prisons, we were with lots of different people, spent a long time talking to individuals incarcerated, people who work there, we had free access, and there's within the employees and the administrators of the prison system an active commitment to the ideal of human dignity. So just ask yourself how often you would find that in a U.S. prison. So that has lots of implications. I mentioned the solitary confinement implication. I mentioned the civilian clothes idea. But the other thing that you would note there is, and so this comes to your second question, John, is you would rarely hear the word punishment ever uttered. So the view there is that the deprivation of liberty is the punishment. That is what we have done to you because you violated the law. But as soon as that happens, everything else is not punishment. Everything else is geared to your return to full citizenship very soon. And the maximum penalty there is like 10 years, and sometimes it's longer, and they have sort of legal distinctions there that are important for us. But the idea is that you are removed from society and put into an environment that respects your dignity, and everything is geared to your speedy return to community. So there's a system of furloughs that you're expected to work. Your family comes to visit. You have you keep the network. So it's not the diminution of citizenship that is so severe is what we see here, and it influences all the purposes of the justice system. So is it punishing to be told that you have to live in a prison for 5 years? Of course, but that the conditions of life should not be punishing. So you asked about measures. I would just say that we have to start by talking about first principles and values and limits on state power and recognition and respect for each other, and then we can talk about measures. It's not something that we measure ourselves out of we can't get ourselves out of here just by better research. This is something, that's why I closed with the values. We have to really have a language of first principles, of values, of relationship between citizen and state in order to get us to a very different place. I would commend to you, by the way, Justice Kennedy's concurring opinion in the recent Supreme Court case, where he talks about the indignity and inhumanity of solitary. And that seems to be an easy place for us to have that sort of discussion.
Thank you, Jeremy. Heather wanted to weigh in on that question also.
Just really quickly, I wanted to say I was not part of the Germany trip, although I've done several similar trips recently. For example, I was just in Zurich and just in the UK and in similar environments. And one thing I just wanted to say, this is again just a pitch for why we need to reckon with sort of our whole history and not just this particular criminal justice moment we're in. One of the challenges in this country is that we need the policymakers to see the people most affected by these policies as their own children, and to employ policies that they would to have the measure be, what would you want to happen to your own child if they were drug addicted, if they committed a crime, if they did something, right? So we have this really long, deep history with racial injustice, and so I feel like in order for us to really move forward, part of our discussion as community members has to be not just the specific policy changes, but to have those discussions be deeply infused with this commitment to racial equality, because we can't explain the U.S. system and why it is such an outlier until we really reckon with our long history with racial injustice, which other countries have their own stories. Certainly the Holocaust is a powerful and horrendous story, but this story, we have to infuse our policy discussions with that story.
Amen. There's a mic going around.
Hey, I just want to thank the panelists. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Your name?
Sorry, I'm Vaughn Crandall from the California Partnership for Safe Communities, formerly of John Jay College, Criminal Justice. And I was really fascinated, especially by the frame that we've gotten here in some sense because of an intentional political and policy decision or set of decisions. So I guess my question to the panelists, and I think especially to Jeremy and Glenn, would be, as we look forward, with this objective of really undoing mass incarceration, I think in some sense, if the network is a reflection of this movement, practitioners are ahead of policymakers. Or I think I'd pose that to you guys. And so what do you see as the relative merit or focus of policy work for its own sake, in the sense that policy decisions have gotten us here, versus reforming practice, policing, prosecutorial practice as how we move forward?
I'm not going to answer. You're going to have to channel me. This is your show. I think he actually...
Well, so in my experience, the primary limiting influence to reform at the legislative level is the prosecutors associations and individual prosecutors. And I think they resist change. They don't like the losing power. And that's interesting because they are an integral part of this system. And the legislators, they're like, tell me what works. And the speaking in terms of fiscal policy or group justice and that sort of thing, it has a place. But I think when I've seen people really get moved, it's when they meet someone like Glenn and hear their story, or when they have a personal touch. Because, at the end of the day, we as humans, we're aspirational beings. And so I think there's some combination of changing what we measure DA's success on right now. They run on conviction rate. you know, conviction rate's not a compelling thing. So conviction rate, and, you know, how do we change that? How do we get the DAs to be part of this, you know, movement and to police one another? Sometimes it only takes 2 or 3 to stop reform. And how do we get more personal touches with the legislators? I've seen them be very responsive.
Maybe there is an emerging consensus. Other questions from the audience?
Yeah, so I was going to say that I actually do hope that we have an emerging, Carol Mason, Department of Justice, hope that we do have an emerging consensus, and I'm going to pose a question. So I think I'm going to pose a question. So do we agree that we want safe communities, safe, healthy communities? And so do we agree that if you stop the inflow into the criminal justice system, i.e. putting more emphasis on the prevention side, and then for those who are in it, changing our emphasis on how do we equip them to return and to be productive citizens, I think if we agree on that, we do have an emerging consensus. The question is just, how do we really do it? And I think that it goes back to your question of seeing it's not this us versus them. It is all us. So my question is, am I wrong in my premise that if we start on the work on the prevention side and work on the side of reentry, that we've got an emerging consensus?
So let me, Carol, I never say you're wrong, but I want to just give you a little spin on it. So if we live in an era of mass incarceration, and we got here by choice, by policy choices enacted through mostly our legislatures, to some extent executive branch agencies, and to some extent, I agree with Tim on prosecutors and judges, but it's us, it's our government officials. It's not because of crime, and that's the deep irony here. And you ask yourself, what's it going to take to get us out of this? If democracy got us here, what's it going to take to get us out of here? What's difficult, I think, for us to sort of absorb is the reality that we can't get out of here by having more crime prevention strategies, or better crime prevention strategies. That's a really tough thing for those of us who have been in this work for a long time to understand. It's not shutting the front door, as important as that is. So you'll cite one more time the National Academy Report, chapters 2 and 3. In this case, I'll get you to download it soon enough. They tell the story of how we got here by looking in chapter 2 at different crime types, and chapter 3 at different statutes that got us here. So the conclusion of those 2 chapters, and to some extent chapter 4, is there are 3 drivers of mass incarceration. This is not us, this is the National Academy. First is we made long sentences longer. And we know the catchphrases that got us here. 3 strikes and you're out. Life without parole. Truth in sentencing. As Tim said, there was just a sort of, it was in the air, it was challenged, but it was the prevailing dominant idea that we'd have more safety if we had more prison. So the first thing he did was he kept people in prison longer who were already going to prison. So the guy who was in who was 50, we kept him in until he was 55. Someone who was 70 was going to be in until he died. Those years in prison, what we know very clearly from the criminological literature, had little deterrent effect and almost zero incapacitation effect. So no public safety benefit. So we were sold a bill of goods. So by preventing crime at the front door, we don't change making long sentences longer. That's number one. Number two, we also enacted mandatory minimums. We said, and we all remember the rhetoric around this, you did the crime, you got to do the time. For this crime buddy, you're going to serve time in prison, no excuses. What we really did was we took discretion away from judges. We took discretion away from a process that was working okay. We de-empowered, that's the right word, alternatives to incarceration, community groups, families, schools, institutions of our society that used to do well the work of taking people who had violated the law and getting them back on track. We said, guess what? We don't trust you anymore to do your work. We somehow think that putting someone in prison for a short period of time is going to be better for him, better for public safety, and is the right, just thing to do. Again, social science literature, very clear for a long period of time, mandatory minimums have minimal public safety benefit because you're taking people who would otherwise have been sanctioned somewhere else and just saying, go off to prison, and prison Takes them out of their jobs, takes them out of their families. It's disruptive. It's criminogenic. So the net effect is no public safety benefit. The third thing we did that Heather and Glenn both mentioned, Glenn, the economist Glenn, is the war on drugs. So we launched a war on drugs. That's the biggest increase in incarceration rates, tenfold increase. Everything else went up fourfold. So is that the only way to respond to drug use, to drug selling? Highly ineffective. So in order to bring things back, you have to do something other than slow down the front.
Tim?
Yeah, I just think a couple of things. One is, I think one of the things that would be a big positive change is to focus on the victims. So the victims of crime rather than the perpetrators. Because if we can focus on restoring the victim rather than what are we going to do to the perpetrator, and how is the perpetrator going to restore, participate in restoring the victim, then that takes out this reflex of prison is somehow the justice reflex for somebody doing something wrong. Another thing that we could do, and I'm a big fan of what's sometimes called victim-offender mediation. Get them a victim and offender together, make it right, avoid the criminal justice system altogether. War on drugs. Who's the victim? Who's the victim of drug possession? Who are we trying to restore? See, it changes the whole conversation and perhaps takes incarceration off of the table. I also think a name change would be helpful. Department of Corrections don't correct anything. Penitentiaries don't cause penance. So I think we ought to call it the Departments of Temporary Incapacitation.
Jump in just really quickly and also say, and this is always not the most popular thing to say in gatherings of people who work in criminal justice, which is that I think that we have a lot of lessons that indicate that the solution to this has nothing to do with the criminal justice system. That is to say, yes, we can improve policing, we can improve sentencing, we can improve all of this, but what we know from time, and we know this from other moments in our history, is that some of the most effective ways to make communities whole and make them healthy and reduce crime and build communities start with the most basic, a really robust and vibrant education system. The data that Glenn shows us about, or I think maybe Jeremy, about the relationship between dropping out of high school and going to prison. So if we're going to really repair this, in some respect, the hardest work we have to do is to give us faith again in schools, give us faith again in job programs, go back to moments in our history when we invested in those things and see what the impact was. And none of those are criminal justice system solutions per se.
Glenn?
Which is a good reason to be wary of happy talk about consensus, even though I engaged in some of it. It's a heavy lift. But what we're talking about here is a heavy lift. So just 2 points. Remember the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill? The numbers in confinement or treatment, however you want to call it, went down like this, but the homeless numbers went up like this. We released people from institutions, but we didn't put local community mental health services in place in order to allow them to adjust. Imagine a similar mistake being carried out with respect to incarceration. It would be an absolute disaster and induce a political backlash. The other observation I'd make is the war on drugs is a huge factor in just accounting, as Jeremy has just said, for the run-up, but decriminalizing drug trafficking is an enormously heavy lift. I mean, marijuana is tremendously controversial, and that ain't the main thing that's driving people going to prison for drug trafficking. So it's easier said than done. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, another question from the audience?
Hi, Tim, you stole my thunder. I'm Elizabeth
I'm
Cronin.
sorry.
I'm the New York State Director of the Office of Victim Services, and I wanted to bring up that very point about including victims in these kinds of conversations, because it's taken the victims field a very long time to even get to a point where they're being heard or considered in criminal justice processes. And so I'm interested in hearing from you about what's the most effective way to do that, you think, in order to make this sort of thing happen, and also to make sure that they feel safe and protected. Because I think for many years, victims saw long-term incarceration as a way that they will maintain their feelings of safety and security. I don't know that that's necessarily true, and so how do we change the conversation for them so that we are considering the victims' rights?
Just one thing on that. One of the things I would love to see us do is to break down this differential between the offender and the victim. If we look at the data on women in prison, for example, these are the same people. And so one of the things that we might do is, again, as you mentioned, the language change. I mean, we need to think about how we characterize this stuff. The overwhelming majority of women who are imprisoned in this country have been victims. Victims of sexual assault, victims of all kinds of things, for example. And so I just throw that out there as, you know, one way we might do that is, again, to kind of break, in many communities, someone who's been a victim of crime may also be convicted of a crime. So to kind of, I don't know.
You know, one of the main narratives I use to get conservative support for this whole movement we're talking about is exactly the same narrative that David used about the inner city youth story. And it is, if someone steals something from you, what do you want? You want your stuff back. And you would like to see the perpetrator learn something in the result. That's all you want. You don't want the guy's life to be crushed. You know, that's not what you want. And so what we have is this system where the government comes in and says, okay, you know, Tim, you stole something from Glenn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crush your life, and I'm going to send you off at $40,000 a year in prison, and Glenn, you're going to pay for it. And by the way, the stuff you stole, I'm going to impound because I may need it later. Well, who wins in that deal? Glenn just got mugged twice. And the taxpayers all, I mean, it's a lose, lose, lose. And people look at me and say, yeah, that's really dumb. So I think, you know, language change and changing the way we talk about what's going on is a big part of it.
We have 5 minutes left. We might get 1 or 2 questions in. Who has the mic? Rick.
Hey, Rick Greenberg from Amplify. Tim, I think you need a talk show. I want to say that. But this is a question for Tim. You know, any kinds of examples you can give of the kinds of reforms Right on Crime has made, the thing, or maybe 1 or 2 things that you're most excited about, and how you were able to use story, if you did, or change the narrative with DAs or whomever the adversaries were in those instances.
Well, it's happening. You know, this is in 33 states, and I'm not the guy on the line. It's Mark Levin and a bunch of many other people, Pew Foundation and so forth. So I won't pretend to know things at that level of detail. The things I'm most excited about is seeing the victim offender mediation bills that are passed and the bills that do diversions. You know, things that have, let's try this instead of prison, you know, bills, all the things that associate with that. But I have to say, one of the problems I think we have, that Glenn talked about it, is a heavy lift. I mean, you can get excited about a child taking 1 step. Oh, he learned to walk. Well, I think that's kind of where we are. You know, we want a bunch of track stars, and we've got people that can take 2 steps, which, you know, why the national, this is so brilliant. This thing you guys are doing, Glenn and Jeremy. I mean, it's brilliant, and it needs. This is the crane that's going to do the lifting. Is everybody in here? You agree with that, Glenn? Yeah. Okay.
All right. We actually have time for another question. This will probably be our last question, however.
Hi, I'm Bea Hansen. I'm with the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice, and I want to thank you all for all the great work you're doing. I guess it's more of a conundrum that's been going on in my head as I've been listening all day today is, you know, we've got these issues of mass incarceration, the things that you all talked about, how do we, you know, how we go about reducing incarceration. I'm also dealing with, in my world, and dealing with domestic violence, that you know, most victims don't want their offender incarcerated, so there's that kind of conundrum of how to really, you know, and you're talking about some of the mediation issues and other issues that have been really a problem within victim services to look at. And then we have the other issue of sexual violence where you know, less than 1 in 1,000 offenders get any kind of incarceration. So how do we, in some cases that we've been looking at our backlogs of rape kits and untested rape kits and serial offenders that haven't been prosecuted. So I'm just trying to, you know, balance all of this conversation. So if anybody has any insight on that, I'd love to hear it.
I'm going to pitch this over to Jeremy.
We want you to leave today feeling balanced. Actually, actually, having a sense of imbalance is probably healthier right now. So let me just echo the thoughts here about a critical role for victims in this movement. And I point to the success of the Proposition 47 in California, Californians for Safety and Justice, under the leadership of Lenore Anderson, who spoke in this room a couple months ago. She led that campaign with victims. She went to victims, did a sort of serious survey of victims in California, and basically said, did you like what the justice system delivered in the crime involving you or your mother or your whatever? And overwhelmingly, for the reason that Tim said, the answer was no. So they became, if you look at the videos that Californians for Safety and Justice created with victims' voices out front, they were the ones who were saying there has to be a better way. Either I want my brother who's been damaged by this crime, I want him treated, or I really think that the guy who's in prison needs mental help, or that the condition that led to the poor lighting where I was sexually assaulted, there still are no lights in that alleyway. So I think victims can be a very pragmatic, very practical, and really elevating part of our discussion because they want justice. Now, put that against what I think is the unfortunate sort of two-dimensional characterization of victims by some in the justice reform movement as we can't let them near this issue because it's always tougher, 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 it's never enough. That's just not true. And add to that Heather's point about the blurry distinctions between, you could say the same thing about men in prison. You know, they've grown up in lousy circumstances, often victims themselves or their family members. So we need to just complexify this whole thing and put victims right into the mix because I think it helps us think about justice. The second point is on your sort of concern about how to talk about incarceration. I'm not saying, I don't think anyone here is saying that nobody should ever be sent to prison. We are saying that if anyone is sent to prison, prison has to be humane. Recognize that people come out at some point at the end of their sentence. And that I think we need to have a language that incarceration should be short. You don't have to, if you think that there's a genuine retributive impulse that should be honored by society, which is my personal view, not everyone's view, such that for some people the offense is so serious that they should be deprived of their liberty, it should be in decent conditions for a very short period of time with reintegration, the goal as quickly as possible, full voting rights, everything while they're put away. So we just need to sort of rethink it. And that I think that even there, the victims of those particular crimes would understand that better than the warehousing forever. So I think we've just sold everybody a bill of goods that's inhumane and expensive and doesn't meet the needs of the folks that you brought into the conversation. So I think we need to just sit down and work it out like tabula rasa. Just what's the right thing to do for this person who suffered, this person who caused that harm. I'm also a big believer in mediation and there are restitution ways to think about things that feel better, they feel right, they feel just at the end, rather than saying, okay, you go off to prison. I mean, Tim's example, that's why he's a successful advocate, a businessman. His example is perfect. Like, what's good about that outcome?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. So we're out of time. I'm glad I opened up the panel by talking about whether or not we're at an emerging consensus, because I think that helped to structure the rest of the conversation. In the spirit of storytelling, which everyone else mentioned, I just want to tell a really brief story to take us out. The day after I went to the White House, I actually spent some time in the basement of Abyssinian Baptist Church in my neighborhood in Harlem. And I spent that time with men and women who had just exited the criminal justice system after serving 10, 20, 25 years. And as I walked in before I was announced, I was listening to the narrative in that room, and it really reminded me of the National Network for Safe Communities' work around redefining narratives, because it was definitely a narrative about America and about how America was crushing them through the criminal justice system. And I ended up starting my story talking about my brother, who's was a federal correction officer and now is a U.S. Marshal. My father was a police officer, to try to help redefine that narrative a bit. And I think we all have a responsibility in our lives, whether it's professional or personal, to help redefine the narratives that we have so ingrained in Americans over the last 45 years. And I do agree that baby steps, and today is yet another one of those. But as I look out onto this audience and I see this diverse audience of people who are involved in the work, I'm hugely hopeful that we will get to the finish line, and that there'll be less days that I spend in the basement of churches talking to people who have had their hopes and dreams crushed by the criminal justice system. Let's say thank you to our panel. Thank you.